Okay, Miliband, we'll start on foreign policy. Actually, a question from one of our kind of youth ambassadors for Stand Up and Be Counted, Michael Adam, 24 years old. He wants to know, you seem to express some support for airstrikes against ISIL. He wants to know, what's the difference between Syria and Israel?
Well, look, let me set out my broad approach. My broad approach on this issue is that ISIL is a threat that cannot be ignored because they are people who are of murderous intent against people of all nationalities, all religions, including British people. I think we've got to learn the lessons of the Iraq War, which are about not just a military coalition, but a coalition which is diplomatic and political. And I also think we need to make sure it's a coalition based in the region, as well as a coalition across the world. Now, I will judge any proposals for UK military action in Iraq, which I've said I'm open to, on the basis of can we make a difference, will it succeed, and is it legitimate and lawful? So that's the approach I'm taking on this issue.
So you do think it's legitimate and you back US airstrikes against ISIL in Syria, but you're not sure about whether Britain should participate in that?
Well, actually, I was talking when what I just said about Iraq, right. A democratic state, you know, that's what I've said I'm open to. On Syria, I think that there was a humanitarian and real threat to people in Syria. I think we do need a UN resolution. I do want to see a UN Security Council resolution, and that's what I've called for.
But you said you supported the US action. So you support the US action, but you don't think the situation's sufficiently bad that Britain should get involved without...
There's a higher bar. There's a higher bar for me for UK military action. Look, I'm not going to go out and say I oppose the US action in Syria because I think that ISIL is a murderous organisation and they do need to be degraded. As far as the use of British combat forces is concerned, I do want to see a UN resolution. That's what I've called for. And I think there's another issue in Syria which is to do with the ground forces. We're not going to commit UK ground forces. Therefore, we need to, if we're going to defeat ISIL, we need to have ground forces that can do that. Now, that's more apparent in Iraq than it is in Syria.
Well, obviously, this is a continuation of an argument that you won effectively a year ago. I just wanted to know whether you feel how events have developed over the past year. Do you feel that has vindicated your position on Syria a year ago, that we would have ended up bombing Assad and that may have hastened ISIL even more?
Well, I think we took the right position, because the reason I took that position is because military action should always be a last resort, and it should have clear objectives. And in the case of chemical weapons, in fact, it did turn out that there were other ways of dealing with the Assad's chemical weapons. Now, you know, the situation in Syria is terrible, but I think we took the right decision.
But you don't think, for example, that if Britain and others in a coalition had acted at that point, that the secular FSA could have made a much better fight of things against Assad and indeed ISIL?
Well, I don't really understand that argument. No, I don't understand the argument of people who say we should have acted in Syria last year in one direction and then in a different way this year. I think we took the right decision on Syria.
In general terms, obviously your history here, you didn't back the Iraq War
Sure.
in 2003. We had the Syria vote. It seems now the direction of travel is that we will be limited in any military action that may or may not occur. Is this a Britain that is now combat weary? Would you make a combat weary Prime Minister?
Well, I think Britain is definitely combat wary, and I think it's right to be, because, you know, the Iraq War is a lesson to all of us about what happens if you don't have proper planning, if military action isn't a last resort. That's why I think it's right to be careful and cautious and considered in any decisions that we make.
Do you have a sort of grand foreign policy plan? I mean, are you thinking about the Kurds, Kurdish independence? There are various groups that we're maybe arming, which are on various lists. Have you got a vision detailed vision for that part that we might expect of Prime Minister.
Well, look, I don't think it's about imposing a vision from the outside on on another region of the world. I think what it is about saying is that you have clear criteria for the use of military action. And if you think about what I've done in this Parliament, I backed action in Libya, I opposed it in Syria, on the basis of clear criteria. Is military action a last resort? Are there clear chances of success? Can Britain make a difference? Is there a legitimate and legal basis? Is there regional support? So I've got clear criteria for any action that we take, military action that we take, beyond self-defence of our country.
Okay, well, let's talk about health. You are now saying that Ed Miliband, as Prime Minister, and the Labour Party are going to save the NHS. Save it from what exactly?
I really worry about what's happening under this government, because they're privatising and fragmenting the NHS, and I think that's bad for the health service. The NHS is going backwards on their watch. I think people are rightly concerned about funding pressures in the NHS. What I set out yesterday can make a difference to that, raising £2.5 billion from some of the richest people in our country, from tax avoidance, from the tobacco companies, to put into doctors, nurses, care workers, midwives. So I think we do need to turn the NHS around. I think it's going backwards under this government, and as I said in my speech yesterday, I worry about 5 more years of this government for the NHS.
No, but one of the funding pressures is PFI payments, and this is a PFI hospital. We won't pay it off till 2042, signed off under your government. That is causing serious funding pressures for loads of hospitals up and down the country, and is an example of a kind of part privatisation that Labour initiated. How can you complain about marketisation now?
Well, this was about hospital buildings. My 2 sons were born in an NHS hospital, which used to be a falling down NHS hospital, and has now been rebuilt under PFI. So, look, yes, that PFI imposes payments on hospitals, but it's also helped transform our
But not a source of pressure on budgets in hospitals?
Of course it's a source of pressure. Of course it's a source of pressure, but it's helped transform our NHS, and they're all of the judgments you've got to make. But I can't rewrite the past, but I can make a difference to the future of our NHS, and that's what I set out yesterday.
In Scotland, your party just last week was saying that it was a scare story and a myth of Alex Salmond that the NHS needed to be saved, and now you've come up and you said it, and Andy Burnham say it does need to be saved. What happened there?
What we said in Scotland was that the NHS in Scotland is run in Scotland, and that is correct. But am I worried about the English NHS and what this government is doing in terms of privatisation? Yes, I am worried about it. Am I worried about the fragmentation? Yes, I am. That's why we need to turn it around.
So one of the ways of funding this £2.5 billion is the mansion tax. Can you see that if you have a collection of £1 million houses, 5 or 6 of them, you don't pay? If you've got one, it's 2.1, you're paying tens of thousands a year. It's rather imperfect tax, is it not?
Well, look, I think no property tax is perfect, but I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say to the wealthiest people in our country, with homes above £2 million, that they should make a contribution to help fund our NHS. I didn't want to raise taxes on ordinary families, but I think this is a fair and the right idea to help fund some of these pressures that we see in our health service.
Do you, looking back at your speech yesterday, it does seem as if more radical reforms, trying to deal with the fact of this huge ageing and population pressure on even flat NHS budgets, that you're shying away from that now? Labour used to be the party of public sector reform. Are you actually a reform? Are you looking at radical options where...
What we talked about yesterday in the speech, what I talked about yesterday in the speech, is definitely radical reform. Look, the fundamental idea is a hospital is only as good as the services in the community. That's why we need more GPs. That's why we need more care workers, because if people can't get to see their GP or can't get home care visits, they end up in hospital. That's bad for them and costs billions of pounds. And given the pressures on the NHS, that's exactly the kind of reform and change that we need.
The NHS is an area... which is an English area, as it were. Is it not fair? Can you not see that issues that are about England, why should your Scottish MPs, why should the Scottish Labour MPs be voting over these sorts of issues right now?
Look, there are always inconsistencies when you have a constitutional reform which devolves more in some areas than in others. It doesn't just apply in relation to Scotland and Wales. It applies in relation to parts of London where some things are devolved, but not in other parts of England. And of course those issues have to be looked at.
But why not act now? We've had this rupture, we've had this debate.
Because for
the Mackay Commission
because for 120 years, people have been, in different ways, people have been looking at these issues. And what's my bottom line in this? If we start creating a situation where you don't have one House of Commons of 650 MPs, but you have a House of Commons that is essentially split up, I think that is not good for our country. We spent 2 years trying to keep our country together. Now we've got a Prime Minister who's come along and said, I'm going to play fast and loose with the Constitution in the 6 months before an election. I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is take a careful, considered look at these issues. That's why I've proposed a constitutional convention led by the people, not led by Westminster. And devolution to England is a massive part of that. See, part of the answer
here... But not yet,
Well,
Mr. Miliband.
no, devolution to England now. We want to see that. That is in our manifesto. Devolution to local government in England. We've had devolution to Scotland and Wales. We need devolution to England. That is part of the answer to the question you're asking.
Is the big problem for you, in this context, that you won't be seen as the Party of England, that effectively you're the English patient, shall we say?
No, that isn't the problem. The problem is that our country is not run for most working people anymore, and that we've got to change that. And what we've set out at this conference is a plan for Britain's future, the whole of our country, whether that's a higher minimum wage, an £8 minimum wage, or spending on the health service, which obviously has consequences for Scotland as well, or dealing with issues of housing, or 0 hours contracts, or all of the issues people are facing in their lives. And that is the election question. Does our country get run for a few people at the top, or does it get run for most working people? And frankly, dividing our country, as this Prime Minister is doing, is not the answer.